In this episode of ClimateGenn, I'm speaking with Dr Minnie Go about her recent book, Rethinking Community Resilience, looking in detail at how the city of New Orleans emerged from the destruction of Hurricane Katrina. Minnie's work looks at how the dynamics between civic groups and governing bodies can determine very different outcomes. Distrust of government by those most impacted communities meant that they worked hard and fast to repair the damage to the same standards experienced before Katrina hit. A better informed approach would have looked at what was necessary to protect them against future impacts that the science tells us are increasing in power and frequency. Minnie's work gives us insight into how civic groups and communities are likely to become more resilient based on the characteristics and efficacy of regional government. In the next episode, I'm speaking to Sir Tim Smith, who created the Eden Project in Cornwall, UK, just over 20 years ago. Tim discusses how the Eden Project has developed and become a shop window for initiatives that are going to be key to our survival in the coming years as climate gets worse. Thanks for listening to ClimateGenn. Please do consider supporting the series via Patreon and/or following on any of the podcast channels or YouTube. Feedback is always welcome too, so don't hesitate to get in touch. I will try my best to respond. Thank you. Minnie, it's lovely to meet you. Thank you very much for speaking to me. Can you start by defining the differences between urban resilience and community resilience, which come up in your book?
Sure. Let me start by defining what resilience usually means and is understood by most people. Resilience largely means the process of recovering from damage and restoring to a functional state, to a pre-disaster or pre-shock level. So when a person is called resilient, it means usually that he or she can go back to her original state after a certain amount of shock. And it also refers to the ability to restore to the physical and mental state. I think that community resilience, as opposed to urban resilience, which I address in the book, highlights this human aspect of recovery. People usually make communities and become attached to them both emotionally and physically, and they want to rebuild their communities right back as soon as possible once disasters happen. Therefore, we usually associate these words such as reconstruction, rebuilding, and repopulation with resilience. Therefore, the speed and extent of rebuilding becomes an important parameter for building successful resilience. Since communities tend to emphasize togetherness, harmony, coherence, regardless of their geographic size, building it faster and better is considered a positive attribute. However, compared to this notion of community resilience, I think that urban resilience means something of a long-term and more of a realistic assessment of the opportunities and restraints of a given jurisdiction. And therefore, urban resilience is more closely connected to the systemic response to vulnerabilities and to minimize and reduce vulnerabilities while not stifling the economic or social viability of a given city. So here, what is important for this notion of urban resilience, I believe, is the concept of adaptation, which not only means restoring back to the pre-disaster level, but thinking in the more longer term of what to do and realistically assessing the future risks and adjusting the size and the scope of rebuilding to the potential shock that might be repeated again.
Okay, and that's really the key in your book, isn't it? It's not just about to get back to where you were, it's about what you can anticipate is coming down the track. Because your book focuses on events surrounding the community resilience in New Orleans around Hurricane Katrina. Can you summarize how Katrina impacted the most vulnerable communities in New Orleans? What was their biggest vulnerability when disaster struck?
Well, here in my book, I identify two kinds of vulnerabilities that struck the communities most. One of the biggest vulnerabilities was something that they couldn't really change or adjust, which was geographic constraints. So the disadvantaged communities, usually communities of color, not only of African Americans, but also Vietnamese immigrants, they were located below sea level. And when the hurricane hit, they were the first to be submerged underwater. And they were located, not randomly, but they were located under the sea level for a reason, because historically, the low-income people of color settled in the city's low-lying areas because the higher ground had already been occupied by their wealthier counterparts. So these areas tend to be closer to water and also suffer from land subsidence. So they suffered the double bind of land subsidence and sea level rise. And when the hurricane struck, the barrier system could not prevent water from encroaching upon their terrain. So I think that that was one of the biggest geographic vulnerabilities that these communities faced. And relatedly, the second vulnerability came from their socioeconomic difficulties. And that has something to do with more long-term consequence of Katrina, because I found in my research that the repopulation rate after Katrina in 5 to 10 years was much higher in the higher ground than the low-lying areas. So even when these poor residents wanted to come back and rebuild their communities, the entire neighborhood did not come back at all, which means that they lacked very important and necessary social infrastructure, such as grocery stores, schools, and restaurants, because they didn't have enough clients who came back to the neighborhood after Katrina. So the recovery or rebuilding was very spotty, haphazard, and incomplete. And that casts a longer term negative consequences in these communities because they have to travel farther and for a longer time, which would then eventually contribute to more pollution and a bigger carbon footprint. So all in all, the socioeconomic underdevelopment and the proximity to water were the two related biggest vulnerabilities facing those communities, which affected not only the extent of damage when the hurricane hit, but also had a long-lasting impact on the livelihood of those people.
Okay, and you've mentioned three sort of elements, three distinct communities. So you have the Vietnamese who came the latest, you have the African American community, and you have the I presume the white American community that predated these guys, and each one has a different level of vulnerability. Katrina strikes and they come back sort of disproportionately relative to the risk. I mean, what was the response from that? Because you've said the businesses we kind of rely on for communities didn't come back in such great numbers, like restaurants and other facilities. What was the rebuilding process?
The rebuilding process was incomplete at best, even though there was this really high zeal among people who wanted to come back and rebuild communities. Hurricane Katrina is a catastrophic event, but also considered a civic victory because the recovery happened in the lack of government assistance, which means that communities actually came together. The community residents actually came together to come up with their own recovery plan and then seek resources from outside, such as Brad Pitt's Make It Better or philanthropic organizations. So, I mean, those civic efforts happened while the government was unable to offer plausible plans for the residents, which was infinite loop of inefficiency because even though they wanted to come back, the government couldn't really provide adequate assistance. And that really built upon the distrust the residents had already accumulated to their city government. So the residents firmly believe that it is in their own hands to actually recover from the disaster and rebuild their own communities. And that was not only true for the affluent communities, because the level of damage was not as extensive as their more disadvantaged counterparts. For example, the Vietnamese community village De L'Est, which is located in the newly developed part of the New Orleans East, they came back really fast. And expedient recovery was made possible because of their strong bond organized around their Catholic Church. So by the time I went back to New Orleans, about 5 years later, they were really well built, and then they just built their communities. Not to the pre-Katrina level, but very close to that. But I wouldn't say it's only good news, because that doesn't really change their geographic conditions and geological conditions, such as land subsidence. Their soil is already sinking a little bit, and they are rebuilding to the place where they had already settled before Katrina, and they were very happy about it. But in the long run, should the same level of hurricane or same magnitude of hurricane happen, then they would most likely be flooded again. So this type of rebuilding would happen over and over again, which would accumulate over time as the risk of climate change increases.
Okay, and this comes up again and again in these kinds of situations where really leadership matters. And what you're saying is that there's a sort of breakdown of civic leadership of the government intervention, and that breakdown of trust, and therefore the communities have had to kind of do it themselves. And in doing it themselves, what they've done is rebuild back very well, but expose themselves to exactly the same thing happening again. This is the bit which I wanted to ask you, how transferable, this is to other regions around the world who might be facing any kind of climate impacts or other impacts. This is the bit that it is transferable, isn't it? It is, how do we respond, not just to get back to where we were, but to be able to face the future? Is this something that you've found yourself?
Yes, people often think New Orleans as a city with unique history, culture, or great food even, and music too. And Hurricane Katrina is considered as this unprecedented disaster like no other. However, in my book, I tend to refute this claim as categorizing New Orleans as a sinking and shrinking city. Sinking city means that the city is located in the coastal area in Delta, which is, also common in many coastal cities. Like you can find many examples such as Ho Chi Minh or Jakarta, which are coastal cities and suffer from sea level rise. It's a shrinking city whose economic or revenue base is shrinking as the population decreases. It's a serious problem in many cities in advanced countries such as Japan or Rust Belt cities in the United States. So I would say the findings from New Orleans are not only transferable, and also can be extrapolated to think about the combination between civic capacity and governing capacity, by which I mean New Orleans is a quintessential case where there is strong civic capacity, high civic capacity, but weak governing capacity. But we can kind of adjust the combination and think about a case where there is a strong, a weak civic capacity and strong governing capacity. What will happen in those cities? And one example could be Shanghai, where there is a very strong political leadership, but weak civil capacity. In that sense, I would predict that there could be government-led redevelopment. So long-term development may be possible, but very uncertain, can be, the process can be very inequitable, as it might happen in places called Echo Island, near Shanghai, where there was a lot of residential developments happening there, but people who could reside in those developments were not those who are exposed to higher climate risks. Another example is where there is a strong government capacity and strong civic capacity. And I would say Rotterdam in the Netherlands would be a very good example where people are willing to cooperate and negotiate with the local government based on strong trust and authority and predictability. So that is where we can think of a notion of resilience as adaptation and adjustment rather than development. So findings from New Orleans are not only transferable, but also can be extrapolated and then apply to other cases, I think.
Okay. And the examples you've given have a different balances. So Rotterdam, Shanghai, New Orleans. So you would kind of have to analyze each situation as it arises and see where the strengths and weaknesses lie, and then build your kind of response around that. But remember that you're not building back, you're facing the future. And it's kind of putting that into the scope. And when you do that, and I think you were saying about it, Rotterdam, that adaptation, because you've got both parties really involved, I suppose it becomes easier, but adaptation towards the future also becomes easier to tackle.
And then I think that cities can learn from each other. When I conducted my fieldwork in Rotterdam, they were already beginning this project called Room for the River, which allows more room in the floodplain for the river to flood rather than build a dam or dike.
Yeah.
Okay. So that kind of project can be made possible once the landowners or homeowners could actually give up on their property near the floodplain and move inland. And that is a complicated process, especially in democratic regimes. And by looking at these examples, we can, cities can learn from each other. And that's one of the arguments I make in this book, that not only should countries cooperate to reduce climate risks, but also there could be low-level intercity cooperation and network that could be built to actually reduce the actual number of casualties and property damage and build a more resilient system that should be grounded in the local context.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. And my sort of question to end on, really, there must be communities everywhere that are realizing they've got some vulnerability, to flooding or to drought or whatever the vulnerability is. And their instinct will be different, I guess. So some will form strong community responses, and others will start lobbying their local representatives. What's your take on people who might be realizing at a community level that they're exposed, and what should their response be? I mean, how should they think about these strategically or rationally or logically?
I think that the instinct or the inclination to restore and rebuild a broken home is not something that is irrational, that is natural. But I want to point out that it is more so among people whose property values are undervalued, and even selling or requesting for buying out doesn't give them much compensation and the possibility to move out. So we can design a framework or program where there is sufficient compensation and enough persuasion for those who live and occupy those precarious, risky areas, making sure that they are well settled in more inland, because it is not only those poor residents, but also those expensive properties in the communities, in the coastal communities along the coast that could incur higher potential cost of damage in any type of natural disasters, especially water-related disasters. And I believe that they are there not because they are irrational, but because there are certain values, aesthetic or some type of social values attached to those properties. But it is, I think, very important for them to realize that their individual decisions have collective consequences. So therefore, making sure that they have a sense of community certainty, but also making sure that they have a sense of responsibility for the community and for the later generation is of key to realizing and implementing a managed retreat in those coastal areas.
Yeah. So almost overcoming an emotional attachment, I suppose, in many cases to build back and stay in the front line when the retreat is the best long-term action. I think you do actually mention how we're more inclined to take short-term actions to rebuild rather than the long-term one, which is less sure in our minds to retreat. Okay, I think we've painted a good picture. And obviously, your book has much more information on this topic, which is totally fascinating, and I think one we're going to be hearing so much more about. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.